My life is a lie. Welcome to Castle of Paint. Today we're going to be painting an old man. There is a bust sculptor called Spira Mirabilis. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Link in the description below anyway. The busts are pretty unique in that it's not always war related like so many other minis are, and they do limited runs, so once the run is done, it's not for sale ever again. They often tell a small story and don't really fit into a pre-existing world or franchise, which creates a lot of artistic freedom. As you can see from the unboxing, they are packaged really nice, and the sculpt itself is super crisp. This is my first one, and I know for sure I'll pick up others as the sculpt is just so nice. This is also my first bust, so we will see how it feels different to 75mm display models, or even normal size 28 to 32mm wargaming miniatures. This is made of resin, so I give it a washy wash and some soapy water to remove any release agent. I am unsure if it is necessary for things from Spira, but I want to be certain anyway. Before we start to construct the bust, it's time to consider how I want the finished piece to be. This is a bust, and so I won't have a base I can be super creative with. Also, with such a nice clean sculpt that already tells a lot of story, I don't want to draw the eye away from it too much. That being said, I have to throw something of myself into this piece. The bust will need a plinth, and I'm going to make that plinth look something like a wooden log. Maybe stump is the correct term. You can see here me sketching my vision for the piece, trying to map out what I want and make it look a bit like the final model. I ran out of space to finish sketching the old man, but I think this produces enough of a roadmap for me to follow. I lay out my tools for mini preparation and get to doing some mild cleanup. Almost none was needed here, so I move on to attaching a rod to the bottom of the bust. I use a small hand drill or pin vise and drill into this flattish part of the bottom of the bust. Then add some brass rod I cut earlier. This will allow it to rest in place in the finished plinth, but for now in my little block of wood I will use to hold it. I use some super glue as the drill is slightly bigger than the metal rod and we don't want it to wobble while I paint. It's also a bit longer than needed, but I can always shorten it later if this gets in the way. Now the main part is properly attached, I can glue on the extra pieces. Here you can see the fully constructed bust. The bust itself is called El Viejo Barba-Leno. Please forgive my pronunciation. Google Translate and my girlfriend, who can speak Spanish, tells me this roughly means the old man. Maybe we're talking about the tree, or maybe we were talking about the druid man feeding the squirrel. Either way, it needs a spray. With the magic of cinema done, we can get on to painting. If you saw my last art piece, you will know that there were lots of greens and maybe spring style colours. So since I am again painting trees and nature, I thought it would be better to do so with an autumn theme. This means reds, oranges and warm browns. To start this process, I take Galvo Back Red from Citadel, a dark red or burgundy colour, and apply it all over the places that are still black. This colour will come back a lot. I often do a zenithal prime, and then I use opaque paints over the top and so lose the whole reason for doing it. Here I want to use the zenithal to guide where I place my shadows, which is why we're starting with that step. With that done, I take burnt umber from Vallejo model color and apply it over the rest of the wooden areas. With the two colors in place, we should be able to see if the effect works. I often see miniatures where the whole back of the piece is a different color, or where large sections in shadow use dark colors other than just grey or black. This is my attempt to emulate that. With the burgundy and the burnt umber done, I make a mix of the two colors, around 50-50. I really do not measure when I mix. I throw the colors together and I hope for the best. You'll see this maybe trip me up in the future. With that mixed paint, I thin it down and try to apply a glaze that will bring the two colors together, going over the areas where the red and the brown look to start in contrast. I think the blend here works pretty well, but perhaps I'll make another pass later. While I was doing the red and brown, I got vibes of an older person who had fallen and so was very bruised. A common sight with my grandparents as they got older and are kind of unhappy for. Let's move back to painting and push such things aside. Now I want to base the leaves. I did a bit of research into autumnal leaves and pulled this reference image. This image shows that some of the leaves can still be green, almost like they're in the process of dying. More morbid tones on this piece it is then. Anyway, I take Balor Brown from Citadel, a yellowy brown, and base coat all of the leaves. This already makes it look pretty warm and autumny. Next we have a few small details to base. I promised myself with this mini that I would base almost all of a section before I moved on, so we're sticking with the tree man first. I based these small vines on the side of the Mini with Citadel Still Leaves and Drab, because I want to use a different brown than I used previously. I make the mushrooms on the forward part of the face the same Baylor brown from before. This is because I will make them orange in the end. Reference image to come when I do them later. My last piece also had orange mushrooms, so maybe this is my thing now and I need orange mushrooms in every piece. Then I paint the other more traditional mushrooms a mix of Still Legion brown from the vines and the burgundy colour for the tops, Garbleback red. These will be much brighter red later, and the stems moving towards a pale bone. Even though some of these base tones match other parts of the Mini, they won't get lost in the rest of the detail. I will use different highlight colours in order to transition them into looking different than the parts around them. With the basing done... Hey look Mum, I did all the basing! I did it all on the one thing. I did it. I didn't get lost and highlight something to the top. Anyway, with the base done, it's time to add some layers to the brown. I start this by taking the burnt umber base tone and adding in some Citadel Ushabti bone as a highlight colour. I then start to glaze this mix onto the bits of the miniature that would be hit most by the light. I think I went too light with the colour, and I think my glaze was not thin enough, as this looks a bit too bright already. I add some more layers, switch up the bone for ice yellow, and try to get my glazes working better. I decided here that my blend from the brown to the red wasn't good enough, so I had another go at glazing them together. I also tried to deepen some of the very shadowed creases by mixing grey with my burgundy and panel lining that darker colour into the folds in the bark. I want to do this and might even highlight the red later, as my shadows do not have a lot of detail, and even though I want them to be in shadow, I need them to be visible and seen on the miniature. With my glazing and stuff done on this barky boy, I think something is off. It looks a bit too cool. I think I might have been better to use warmer highlight colours mixed with the base tone. I do normally use bone colour and burnt umber as a recipe to paint skeletons, but I did not think we would go so cool and deathly so fast. In an attempt to resolve this, I glaze with Citadel Baylor brown from before. This paint is a nice warm yellow brown, and hopefully it will make the tree look a little bit less dead. This here is a real glaze. The paint is so thin that it's more of a wash, but it does tint the bits I want it to, and so that is all that matters. I'm not sure if this resolves the issue I have. Perhaps I'll need to do some extra work to the wood later, but for now let's move on to something else. It is time for the leaves, and I think I might die. I take orange and red, a green and a kind of green, then I base different leaves different colours. I glaze each colour on, as I don't really want it to completely remove the yellow brown underneath, and I try to keep things random. Some of the leaves I leave completely, and so we have 5 slightly different colours of autumnal leaves. With the leaves now coloured in and my sanity mostly in place, let's move on to the next step. These leaves need a bit more depth. There are some bits I think should be darker, and I think all of the colours could be brought closer together a tad. For this I think I'll use a wash. There is no way I'm going to be able to paint the shadows here, and a tint to all the leaves will hopefully help me. But what colour wash? As you can see, I have a few. I go with a red wash, Citadel Carabao Crimson, and paint all of the leaves. This brings in more warmth and does bring them together a lot. The one issue I have with this step is that it makes it hard to tell which leaf is orange and which one is red. Same for the green and greeny blue. But that might not be such an issue, so let's push forward. After letting the wash dry, I start to edge highlight. Yes, I am a madman that is going to edge highlight every single leaf. To do this, I take the 4 base colours and add some ice yellow to them in order to make them brighter versions of themselves. Then I apply to the edges, going one colour at a time. As I mentioned before, I cannot tell many of the colours apart, so I kinda wing it, and I'm sure that some of the leaves were highlighted with the wrong colour, but it doesn't matter, it just adds some more randomness from nature. Nature is random. I completely ignore using the blue, green plus yellow as an edge highlight because I just can't tell it apart from the green leaves, so I do the process with only the green. Now they are done. I think I want to push it a little further, so I'm going to make a super bright mix for each colour, maybe use bone, not ice yellow, and then hit the tips of the leaves that the light would hit. Less is more here, so I'm going to have to be careful to not overdo it. With the leaves complete, I can move on to some of the fun little details, starting with the mushrooms on our boy's face. I give it another layer with Citadel Baylor Brown to make sure it's an even coat. Then I add my bright orange from before. I add more layers, and as I do, I add more orange. While I do this, I try to make stripes on the mushrooms to provide some texture. This should allow them to stand out and create some depth to this part. After a while, I'm just using my orange, then some ice yellow added to the mix, again trying to make those lines. To give the effect of these parts are more in shadow, I take an Agrax Earthshade wash from Citadel and apply it on the underside of the mushrooms. I also apply it on the sections of bark that would be covered by this shadow. Next, I use Caribou Crimson wash to bring this shadow into our red shadowy theme. I did similar mushrooms on my last piece, so maybe this is just my thing now. Mushrooms. Orange mushrooms. Everywhere. With those mushrooms done, it's onto the more madcap ones the barky lad has on his shoulder. I checked some references for this one and chose to follow the red with white spots idea. I take my dark burgundy, Galvorback red from Citadel, and add some flat red to the mix. The same red we used in the leaves. Then I started to glaze onto the tops of the mushrooms. I found it hard to know where to highlight during this process. I knew the very tops of the mushroom needed it, but do the edges need it too? Do I leave a dark section on the part that's facing towards the front of the model? I don't know, but I keep going, lost in madness, and I think it turned out okay. The next step in Mushroom World is add our dots. First I do this with my brightest highlight colour, then I do this with pure white grey. Mushrooms complete, and so I return to the bark. I think the areas around the eyes look a bit flat, and even though this red is supposed to be shadow, I want to give it variation so the eye is drawn there. I add some ice yellow to my Galvorback red and paint around the eyelids. Let's do a fun little detail now. Nestled into a burrow on our tree is a teeny tiny owl, an ugla in Swedish. I did some owl research, and by research I googled owls and I picked the first one that looked cool. So using this reference image, I decided to paint it white and tan. The paints to do this being Vallejo White Grey and Citadel Baylor Brown. I apply each of these in stripes, trying to emulate the feathers on my reference image. This proved hard as the owl is very small and each layer covers the previous one on such a small surface. The beak gets 2 thin coats of Vallejo Flat Yellow and the eyes get a nice coat of glossy black. With this fun little detour done, it's time to complete the final parts of the tree. We have the eyes and the vines to do. For the eyes I wanted something that would pop against our red-brown bark, so I picked blue. I did a base of Vallejo Prussian blue followed by Temple Guard blue. This is a part where I have to be super careful, as I really do not want to get blue on any other part of the model. After some layers of the brighter blue, I add in some Vallejo Grey White to brighten it and layer it on in very careful horizontal lines. I think this looks really striking. It gives our tree man a magical feel. With that cool bit done, let's get on to the boring bits. For the vines, I take the base Citadel Steel Legion drab and add some Screaming Skull to the mix. This area is also small, so it's hard to glaze here, and I just add the highlight layer. After a few layers, this looks good enough. For the flowers, I want to add some warmth, so I paint them a bright orange I used on some of the other leaves. I add ice yellow to this base and start to layer. After a few layers, this section looks good enough to call complete. As you saw in the sketch at the beginning, I want some form of plinth to hold our woody boy. I designed this in Fusion 360. I take a simple cylinder and then stretch it out to have a gradient. The next steps are me adding lifelines to the top of the stump, areas sticking out the sides for me to sculpt roots on top of, and then finally taking some bark texture and embossing it into the cylinder. Let's take a moment and watch the magic happen. With the man tree done, it's now time for the tree man. I want to use some contrasting colours of him, so there is some pop in the piece, and we can tell the difference of where the man ends and the tree starts. I play around with some colour choices in my mind and look up some other people who have painted this bust, but in the end I chose to do blue. I take Vallejo Prussian blue and base coat the main tunic part. I'm going to take this as my midtone, glazing both up into the highlights and down into the shadows. Before that, let's base coat everything. I add burnt umber to the sleeves of the jacket as I want his sleeves to be the beige bone colour when complete. And then I completely changed my mind. He has sleeves and then an undershirt with longer sleeves. So this part of his tunic is also based blue, and the bits that go further up his arms get the burnt umber treatment. I think this blue might make the old boy look too cold. We'll have to keep going and see where we end up. I base the skin with Citadel's Bugman's Glow. The hair gets Army Painter Uniform Grey, my only Army Painter paint. The little bangle on the arm gets the ever useful burnt umber. The bottle, which I considered making a silver bottle for some NMM, gets instead a glossy black. Okay, with the base coats done, let's tackle the biggest part of the old dude, his blue tunic. This is a large area, and so good practice for me to work on my glazing and gradients. I start by making a shadow color. The base tone will be my mid-tone. I wanted to read as that blue in the end, but it will need contrast. I add Galvorback red to the Prussian blue to make my shadow color. I then glaze it into the areas where I think the light would be absent. I angle my brush so that the end of each stroke, where more paint is applied, is where the shadows will be darkest. This purplish color looks great, but my first go is a tad rough. That's okay as I can glaze back in the mid-tone. I thin down the Prussian blue a lot and do the same process, but I angle the brush the opposite way so I get the lighter glaze of Prussian blue over the edge of the shadow mix. This is one area where I think I'm learning that I need to take time and not just consider it set in stone once I've added a colour. I can glaze back and forth like this for a long time, and maybe it's what I should start doing, focusing on getting the blend to look precisely as it should do. With our shadows looking good, we need to add the highlights. When you boil it down, it's all about light and where it falls. For the highlights, I take my mid-tone Prussian blue from Vallejo and add in Vallejo blue-green. This mix is more blue than blue-green, but as I move up, I'll increase the blue-green part of the mixture. I add thin layers onto the parts that the light would hit most, considering bits from the front are likely to get more of them sun rays. Maybe he should be wearing shades. Where are my shades? If I feel like the highlight was too harsh, I can just glaze the mid-tone back in. I think I'm getting the hang of this, but I'm not sure how to translate these steps to areas in more detail, as they have a lot less surface to work with. After a few layers like this, I do some final edge highlights with pure blue-green and our tunic is complete. Our elderly gentleman has a nice leather messenger bag here, a perfect opportunity to practice my leather recipe and technique. Normally I add bone colour to my burnt umber, but here I add Vallejo red leather. I layer on thinking about where it'd be brighter and what area would get more wear, trying to get that nice leather patina look. After some layers of progressively more red leather, I start to add ice yellow to the mix. The first time I do, it's too bright, so I remix and apply a darker layer before returning to the process. Then we add scratches and edge highlights with the brighter mix. The scratches on part of this bag look great, but I think on the strap over his shoulder they look a bit too uniform. A sharper brush and a steadier hand is needed here to make those little scratches look properly real. Finally, I mix some burnt umber with Galvorback and glaze in a couple of shadows where I think it's got too bright. For his shirt sleeves, I want to have a creamish colour, a very common colour in medieval tunics, which is a kind of dirty off-white. I base coated with burnt umber, so we need to run up the scales pretty fast. To start with, I mix burnt umber with Citadel Screaming Skull and layer it on. You can see here that there's a pretty strong contrast, and we can leave the underarms plain brown. I continue to add some more off-white to the mix until I'm happy with the result. Back to the skin. The base colour I used, Bugman's Glow, is a great ruddy base tone for Caucasian skin, but I feel like I want to go deeper in the shadows. I take some Galvorback and mix it with Bugman's Glow to pull down that skin tone. Then I add it into the creases of the skin and anywhere I feel would get the shadow treatment. I'm really enjoying putting in the shadows where I want them to go. I feel this gives me a lot of control of how things will turn out, and is better than just adding a wash to everything. Our next steps are going to be to add Kislev flesh to our Bugman's Glow. Let's count the layers and see how long it takes. With this skin looking decent, I want to base the eyes. I've seen a lot of people do the eyes first, and I think I'll try that next time, but on this scale, either way works. I get some Vallejo white and paint in the squidgy orbs. He looks creepy like this. I'm gonna leave him creepy and just move on. How in the name of all that is holy do I paint nails? I don't know. I'll ignore it and come back later. Let's do our old man's grey hair. Just like with our skin, I want to paint in the shadows. This time I take neutral grey base tone and mix in with dark blue grey to get my shadow colour. It's a bit hard to paint shadows here, and there are some defined hairs and some textures in other areas, so I make do what I can. Once my shadows are in place, I start to add a tiny bit of white to the mixture and layer up the highlights. I keep forgetting the eyebrows, so I'll get these finished off screen. I keep adding more and more white as we layer up until I hit the very edges with just pure white. With the hair complete, let's finish the eyes. I've had enough of the creepy blank stare. After toying what eye colour to use, I decided to match the eyes of the dreamer. This is an attempt to draw parallels between the two. I take Temple Guard blue and attempt to make an iris. The key is apparently to not make a circle, but to allow the top and bottom eyelid to overlap the iris. It is very hard to do this on a smaller scale miniature, but here a steady hand is enough to make something semi-decent. I do clean up the eyelids during this process, off camera. I just take the skin colour and go over any bits where I miss. I avoid drinking coffee that day, and then I can do eyes. The eyes here are even big enough to have a pupil and still see the iris. So I take Vallejo black and put a dot of it into the blue, trying to consider where he's supposed to be looking and to not make him look too shocked. Finally, we put the tiniest dot of white to count as a reflection. With that dot I add some glossy varnish, as eyes are wet. Okay, I've avoided it long enough. Now I need to do nails. I did a lot of research on nails on the internet. You might ask why I did not look at my own nails. It's because I'm dumb, and I didn't think that I had my own nails. In the end, it seems that nails are the same colour as skin, with brighter bit at the end. Who would have known? So I use Bugman's Glow Mix on the nail itself and add some Kislev flesh right at the end. These also get some gloss varnish as nails are also wet? Right, moving on swiftly. Clay pot time. I take my base mix and I add in some Baylor brown to bring up the colour. The location of the pot on the bust makes it really hard to film, so please forgive focus issues here. The pot is not anything special, as we just keep adding Baylor brown and hitting the shadows. There's a slight texture on the top of the lid, so I attempt to keep that. But otherwise, I think we can skip over this. The rope around the lid of the pot gets the same treatment as the lever on the rest of the mini. Now it is time for the bottle. This bit is something new to me, and so it's going to be a challenge. I once again did my research, and it seems that the key here is to make a waterline on the pot, and this waterline needs to be horizontal when compared to the base of the piece. The problem here is that we don't really have a base, and this is only one part of the model, with a big chunk chopped off the bottom. Even so, I need to make a line. With this done, it's now time to add the liquid. The idea is that the waterline at the top and the bottom of the liquid will be brightest. So I start to glaze using my funky turquoise colour, see Vallejo blue-green, with the brightest bits going towards the bottom of the bottle. Because of the cut-off for this bust, I think this was harder than a full bottle might have been, but at least the scale gave me some room to play with. Once I've done the highlights here, I add some gloss varnish to give it a shiny look. We're on the home stretch now, people. Let's finish up some tiny details. The tiny bird's nest is yet another brown, but I don't want it to meld with all the other browns, so I take the ever-present Vallejo burnt umber, but this time I mix in some Vallejo dark blue-grey to get a shadow tone. For the little acorn, I base it with just flat burnt umber, and our squirrel gets Galvoback red. With the squirrel, I toyed with making it a grey squirrel, not a red one, but in the end, red won out. In England, where I'm from, we used to have more red squirrels, but in the Great Squirrel Wars of the Last Age, the greys won, and the reds are now so rare that I'm not sure I've ever seen one. With those base colours done, it's now time for some highlighting. For the nest, I take my base tone and mix in some Steel Legion Drab, again to try and keep the brown a little bit different to other places on the model. After a few layers hitting the edges of the twigs to make up the nest, I add some more ice yellow and hit the very tips. For the eggs themselves, I do the same process, but I use Citadel Screaming Skull as opposed to Steel Legion Drab. Here I jump up the colours pretty fast and get closer to the bone colour quicker, this time ending in just pure Screaming Skull from Citadel. Sometimes the full gradient and loads of glazing is just not worth the effort. Okay, final bit. It's squirrel time. I went to Google for references, and as you can see here, a red squirrel is actually orange. My life is a lie. Nothing is sacred. Here are the paints I'm going to try and use on this little guy. We start with adding Citadel Wild Rider Red over the dark base tone. This little boy is tiny and fluffy, but I cannot pick out each hair, so I start by highlighting the whole volumes. I then add some Fire Dragon Bright to the mix and start to draw lines over the foof, also picking out anywhere there is actually sculpted fur. A few layers with each time some more Fire Dragon, and then I add in some Ice Yellow to brighten up some more, doing small lines in different directions to get that fur texture working. Add some glossy back to his little eyes, a final dot of white, and... Okay, so I suppose you want to see the full thing, right? I mean, it would be really rude not to show you. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed seeing this come to life. Stay tuned for more, and if you want to see any other things that we're doing, head to castlepaint.com.